I'm Marci Baker from Alicia's Attic, where we show you the clear view of quilting. And we have a question from Marie of New Hampshire that she'd like to know how to finish the edge of her grandmother's quilt. It's grandmother's flower garden and she doesn't want to put a binding on it. And I have done a facing, so I'm going to share that and show that to her with this video. So Marie, here's what we're going to do first. Step one, we have your quilt that is layered and quilted all the way, and you have your irregular edge that we're going to keep. And what we need to do first is we need to stay stitch around just inside the 1/4 inch seam allowance, and we're going to trim away the extra batting and backing. Let me show you how that works. To do the stay stitching, we're going to stay stitch just inside our 1/4 inch seam allowance. And let's do that. You can use a longer stitch if you'd like. Stop with your needle down and pivot where needed. This one will require quite a bit. I would keep working this around. You can see here the white thread, and that's going to create not only my basting through all the layers, but it creates a guide for me on the back side of my quilt. So I'll be using that a little bit later. Now to trim this away, I just trim, leaving a few inches extra batting and backing. Okay, now that we have stay stitched and trim away the extra batting, we're going to go to the next step, which is folding our facing in half and pinning it to the front side of our quilt. Okay, so we'll be pinning it there, and let me show you how we align that exactly. Here's our facing. I've cut it 6 inches wide because I have 1 inch of depth in my design here, and then I'm going to have 2 inches past that to make a fairly nice wide binding or border finish. And I'm going to fold this facing strip in half, and I'm going to position it to where I'm laying it across one edge of my design, and I line it up with these points of the design, needing to allow for a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so it's just right at the tip of those points. And I also want to leave a bit of a tail, maybe 5 or 6 inches depending on how wide this strip is, at least the width of the strip folded in half, and that's going to allow for my miter later. So I'm going to pin this in place, and I'll pin it coming from the front side here. I think you can see those white pins. And just keeping those edges lined up and lining it up with those outer points. On the last step, we pinned our facing to the front side of the quilt where we needed it. Now we're going to go to the back side of the quilt, and we're going to stitch just inside that previous stay stitching that we had done. That gives us our outline, and we know where to stitch, so we keep our irregular shape. Let's look at that. We pinned the facing on to the front. Now on the back, you can see the outline from our previous stay stitching. We're going to stitch just inside, so we're more like on a 1/4 inch seam allowance than we were when we were taking the narrow basting. And where we have 2 edges of our piece coming together, we're going to start and stop our stitching for our facing at the halfway point between here and here. If it's a 90-degree angle, it ends up being right at the corner. But this is being a 60-degree angle, we're going to have to stop and start right here. You might want to do a little bit of a back stitch at that stop and start, and it would be better not to be over into the other facing area. And make sure you remove those pins so that you don't stitch over them and break a needle. And just follow it around. Now that we have stitched along the back side, inside our stay stitching, now we have it stitched on the front, and we're ready to trim off the extra batting and backing following that irregular shape. Let's look at how that's done. On the back side, you can see this double line of stitching. We're going to use some very sharp scissors, and the sharper they are, the better this is going to go for you. I'm using a small pair of Kai scissors, and that's K-A-I. I really like them because I can snip in this next section very easily. I'm going to come in and I'm going to trim so that I leave my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I come in and snip from one direction on these diagonal lines. Then I come back and do the other direction, keeping it so that I can have my scissors coming in. Then we're going to come in and we're going to snip really tight in at that V. And you want to make sure you don't clip those threads, but you need this to be able to open up. And we'll do that here. You're going to be clipping through the thread, the first thread, but not through the second thread. That's any V point that you're going to do. And then any point that's sticking out, you're going to trim straight across, right up next to that thread. So we don't catch the thread there, but we did catch into the stay stitch. That's the trimming. Sometimes on these seams they get really thick, so I will go in and grade out just this layer of batting, and you can even trim off this backing a bit and just clip out, keeping your scissors flat to the surface, and get out that little bit of extra batting. You can do that if you want. If you don't, that's fine. It'll just make it a little bulkier on the edge. Takes a little bit more time, but it makes for a nice finish. We're almost finished with this irregular shaped edge, and we're going to be putting that facing on by turning it around to the back side. We've stitched and trimmed and clipped, now we're ready to turn it, and that's the very last step. Once we turn it, then we're going to stitch it down by hand on the back side. Let's look at how that is done. Here I've trimmed and clipped, and I accidentally clipped into my stitching on the back side. What I'll do is I'll go back and I'll re-stitch this point, making sure that I have taken care of that. Otherwise this will start fraying at the point, and we don't need that. Once we fix any points that we made a mistake on, then we're going to take and we're going to turn the facing to the back side. And you might want to have a point turner, or I just kind of wiggle those corners. And I get the facing all to the back, and you can see here how that's going to lay down. Because I have this folded piece, I'm going to be able to stitch this down right along here by hand. And let me show you how we miter the corners. Here I have my ends that I need to figure out how to miter. I'm on the front side, I haven't turned the facing to the back yet, and I have these two tails. What I'm going to do is I'm going to line these up so they're right on top of each other, and they both are aligned with the raw edges and along with the folds. And I'm going to get it laying down flat and smooth one direction, and I'll press that at the ironing board. And then I will fold it the other direction, and I'll press that. What that gives me is two creases that give me those folds and seams so that they will miter very nicely on the back. If I have those creases pressed in there before I turn to the back, then I'll know where to trim and everything will lay out smoothly. So here we have the miter that I've turned to the back, and I've been able to hand stitch this here whenever I was hand stitching these down. So that's how we finish this facing very easily, not having to miter every single corner. And Marie, we appreciate you asking the question about how to face rather than bind and get this irregular shape. Hope it works well for your grandmother's quilt, and send us a picture whenever you get it done. For those other viewers, if you have a question of your own, give us a call, send us an email. We'd be glad to answer your question and give you the clear view of quilting. Thanks a lot.